So, Deacon Kevin Barkocy teaches science at St. Pius X, chemistry?
Physics.
Physics.
Yes.
And it also serves at Prince of Peace Church in Albuquerque.
So hey, thanks everybody for having me. It's good. I like this little intimate setting. I always feel like I should just sit down and we should be like dining together. I'm a presenter, so you feel obligated to stand. I don't know what that's all about. So as Father mentioned, I teach at St. Pius High School. I teach a variety of theology classes as well as my science class, and I love the sort of duality of that nature. I've got my science training from these Howard Halls. Talk about chemistry. That's my background as well. I got my chemistry degree from right here at UNM, and my theological training up at the University of Notre Dame. And then I was ordained 4 years ago as a deacon. And as a teacher at St. Pius, I get questions from students a lot, and they're even Pius students, right? But I get this, how can you be a science teacher and still a deacon? Aren't they at odds? Isn't faith and reason, isn't science and theology at odds? And the answer is unequivocally no. In fact, they blend together so naturally, especially when you put them in the right perspective. And so tonight's presentation, and it's going to be more of a dialogue, I hope, than an actual presentation, is to kind of give you some of my insights into this journey through faith and reason, and give you some, not so much a specific tool or a skill set per se, but just a confidence that to be a believing Catholic does not put you at odds with the scientific world. And that's a pretty comfortable place to be, even though the scientific world may speak against it. And there are some people in the religious community who think that if you adhere to certain scientific principles, you're an apostate, and that you don't know what you're talking about, and we don't have anything to do with you. So I begin with a letter from one of my students, and I think it speaks much to sort of the philosophy of this discussion, because it's an apologetics group, and so we'll talk about sort of the apologetic side of life, but I think some perspective is in order. He begins, "I am an atheist." He says, "Now given the context of this essay, it should be qualified. I've been deeply affected by Catholic Christianity as other sects throughout my entire life." He goes on to say that he was formally educated through Catholic schools. He became sort of disenchanted with the self-righteous hypocrisy that he witnessed in its believers. He began to be a little more questioning through his middle school years. He said, "My religion changed just as I began a true pursuit of faith. I found myself to be just a complacent Christmas and Easter Catholic." He said, "I committed my final step into apostasy when I finally ceased to pray and receive the Eucharist. I became staunchly anti-theist in my Catholic school. I would argue with anyone and everyone that would listen, demanding attention much like that of a whining child. I am an atheist," he says, "but no longer a hateful one. I have released the hate and lapsed into forgiveness and love. The single greatest factor in my change in attitude was those Catholics who welcomed me." And that's the title of his essay, is Welcoming Others. He said, "I was a bratty, stuck-up atheist, but my college and my Catholic English teacher welcomed me anyways. I would argue incessantly, but my moral theology teacher threw open the doors to an honest discussion. I know because I was his moral theology teacher, and he argued incessantly, almost on principle. Even if he agreed with me, he would argue just to be that kid that would argue about everything. But again, reaching out and being welcoming. The experience that most changed my life was my time." He spent some time. Anybody ever heard of Amigos program? The Amigos program. It's like a missionary group. Amigos de las Americas. They are volunteer students who go and spend either 6 or 8 weeks in country, in Central America countries, doing missionary work. He says, "The experience that most changed my mind was a 60-year-old Dominican woman who welcomed me into her humble home for 8 weeks, fed me, and loved me like I was her own son. This woman shone with what I can only describe as the light of Christ. As I worked on my community service project in the small community in El Rosario, she consistently showed a happiness and love that has only ever been matched by my own mother. She demonstrated to me that Christianity was most certainly a positive force in the world, that for every tragic story of abuse by a priest, there are thousands of CRS workers in foreign countries to bring about heaven and earth. That for every self-righteous person who judges me based because I'm an atheist and doesn't get to know me, there are 10 more Catholics who love me regardless and pray for me every day." So, he ends this with saying, I'm an atheist and you are a Catholic, and I hope you accept my sincerest apologies for past sins, as well as my sincere desire that in the future we can work together to bring about a peaceful world. And I read you this essay because I think as we begin this journey towards faith and reason, we have to sort of separate validity versus value. Because I think as apologists or as somebody who's passionate about our faith, we tend to engage perhaps the atheist or the scientific person with validity, right? We're trying to prove our side. We're trying to show them in a logical, intellectual, scientific fashion this existence of God, that the realm of science does not completely disregard the realm of the eternal. But what we should be showing them is value. Right? Because when an atheist or a science guy says, I don't believe in God, they're really saying, what's the value if I do believe? How will this change me? Why would I do this? And that's our job. That's our job, is to be Christ in a way such that people who don't believe see us and say to themselves, what is different about them? How can I be like that? True evangelism takes place when we love like Christ and get others excited about Jesus because we're excited about Jesus. Does that make sense? So it's good to put this thing in context, because sometimes we get so, I just need to find that right proof from Augustine. I need to get that one quote from Thomas Aquinas. I need to get this one thing from whatever, Scott Hahn, or whatever it is. But in all my years of dealing with atheist students and with engaging in dialogue in the public sector, I've never found an argument that was as effective as somebody just sitting down with me and saying, Deacon, I noticed that in the midst of my sorrow, you were there when nobody else was. Like, I don't know if this Jesus thing is true, but he's done something in your life. And maybe that opens a door. So just prepare that. As you engage first with example and then with intellect. Does that make sense? So, with that being said, I ask this question to my students. If God manifested himself or herself or itself, just bam, there was God, what questions would you ask? And my students would say a lot of the typical stuff, right? Why did my grandma die? Why is there cancer? Why did they get in a car wreck? Like a lot of the negative stuff. But as we dig a little deeper, they get into the questions of the big whys. Why is this universe here? What is after death? Why was I created? What is the meaning of life? And those big why questions, science can't answer. Right? There's a realm of the eternal that exists only with answers that lie in the spiritual. And so, if you're talking to somebody who is, of the science mind or anti-whatever, and if you get past that and you've shown them love and now they're curious, you can ask them, like, is this it? Is this all there is? This life, this now, this realm of present? What if there's more? What if there is eternity? What if God is real? What would that do? And it gets them to thinking about the fact, okay, maybe science doesn't have all the answers. Because that's what we hear from young people all the time. I don't need religion because science gives me all the answers. Really? What is science's answer to love? What is science's answer to forgiveness? Even in this realm of evolution, right? Of this Darwin kind of theory, right? The survival of the fittest. The survival of the fittest would not prescribe that if you harmed me, I forgive you. Where in Darwin's theory is forgiveness? Doesn't make any sense. And yet most people who are normal functioning in society would say that's a pretty good quality to have for functioning society, is forgiveness, have love, have joy. These are not words that can be defined scientifically. So there's certain concepts that the scientific mind or the scientific community can't quite answer, and they don't really care. I don't know why. They just kind of live in that realm. But these are big questions. And then the next thing is, okay, so that the whole sort of premise of this presentation is, how can God and science, how can science and faith and reason be meshed together? And it goes way, way, way back there's this from a historical perspective. I'm just going to go through some of the saints and some of the key players throughout history. So Saint Albert Magnus, back in 1193, he was a Dominican friar and priest, and described as one of the most famous precursors of modern ages and middle and high ages. He was a chemist. They called it alchemy back then, but he was well versed in chemistry. He was well versed in physics, in logic, metaphysics, biology. One of the great thinkers of the time, also a Catholic priest. Okay, so if somebody says, well, it's impossible to be both, look at history, right? And that's the beauty of the internet. You can just Googleo there's hundreds of priests and holy people who are also brilliant scientists throughout the times. Copernicus, have you ever heard of Copernicus? Science guys here? Copernicus, right? Inventor of calculus, right? The heliocentric model. This comes up with this idea that it's not the universe evolving around the earth, it's the sun is the center and the planets evolve around the sun. There's some debate as to whether or not he was a priest, but there's certainly validity that he was born into a Catholic Christian home, that he was educated in Catholic schools. He was well-versed in, an expert in canon law, and yet one of the great thinkers of that era. And this guy is one of my favorite ones. How many of you guys ever heard of this guy? Yes. Brother George's Lamartine, right? Yeah. Okay, so he's a father, and he's the father of the Big Bang. Right? He was working simultaneously alongside of Einstein. As Einstein sort of developing his theory of relativity, Father Lamartine is talking about this concept of a singular moment in time, some sort of a beginning and then an expanding universe. So they hung out together a lot, and this is one of my favorite slides that I found. Discussions on quantum physics with Einstein on Saturday, consecrates the Eucharist on Sunday. I think it's fantastic because it shows how easily, and Einstein, I read a book called Einstein and Religion. It's not Einstein's religion, it's Einstein and religion, and the author made a point to point that out. But Einstein was not anti-religion. He was not anti-God. You have to remember, this guy was contemplating the duality of substance way back when, right? Light being both particle and wave, this idea of time and matter being interchangeable. So this concept of Eucharist, this concept of substance having a duality of nature, was not inconceivable to him. What he rejected was sort of the fundamentalist perspective of Scripture, like the 5 24-hour days in Genesis, and sort of the literalist view of Scripture. He couldn't quite match that up in his brain, so he sort of rejected that side of it. But he was very much open to the existence of a deity. Yeah.
He was Jewish, right?
Both. He was raised with very much Jewish influence and very much Catholic influence in his. So he was well versed in Old Testament and Torah, and he was also versed in Christianity and Catholicism and Eucharistic theology. So yeah, he was both. But I thought, how many people would even know if you said Big Bang? How many people would think Catholic priest? You guys would, right? Now all of you would after this, right? But not many people do. In fact, at Pius, it's astonishing how many students come from middle schools, and our science teachers, I teach in a freshman science course, and like you mentioned, Big Bang, and they're like, oh, you're an apostate, if you say the word Big Bang, you're going to hell, and they don't understand that there's this history that exists. But then we'll kind of go into more modern times. Anybody heard of Gregor Mendel? Right? You genetics people out there, right? The father of modern genetics, the dominant recessive alleles, this whole idea of the Punnett square, right? So he was actually a Catholic priest. And it's funny, though, that your science teachers here, it probably won't say the father part, right? They're going to say, we're going to study Mendelian genetics, get out your textbooks, turn to chapter 17, we're going to talk about the different alleles, X and Y, and blah, 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 right? And he's like, was it true that he was a priest? I wonder if they even know. I don't know if they even know that kind of stuff. But he was definitely an ordained priest. And then finally, our own John Paul II. Faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises, the contemplation of truth. God has placed in the human heart a desire to know the truth in the world, to know himself, so that by knowing and loving God, men and women may always come to the fullness of truth about themselves. Right? So this idea of faith and reason John Paul II described it as the twofold process to discovering the true self. And I think that is so important as an ordained science guy, because one without the other leaves the whole picture somewhat dim. Because science can explain a ton about the natural universe. Science explains a lot about the how do things work, about so many different things. Religion's the why. Why are we here? Why do we love? Why are we searching for something besides ourselves? Why do we believe in something that gives us hope and joy, peace, and love and grace? Right? So there's, and if I was just a science guy, I'd miss out on whole peace. And sadly, sometimes people are so stuck on the religion side of it and deny, like, oh, science is bad, that they miss a really, really cool, fascinating part of this world. So to embrace both, they are not in conflict, they are complementary. And John Paul II said, if there is a conflict between faith and reason, it's because one or the other one is being used inappropriately. That if they're using science to disprove God, that's not the purpose of science. If you're using religion to not valid or to discredit science, then you're using religion in the wrong way. So they really are beautiful pieces of the same puzzle. And in my own life, I have seen both God and science work in spectacular ways. And so I'll give you a little bit about my story, about my insight. So that, it's kind of hard to see him, but that happy young fella standing in the middle there on the championship podium is my son, Nathan. And this picture was taken when he was just starting his freshman year in high school. He was 14 years old. That race right there is Tour of the Gila. He was the youngest cyclist ever in his... So the cycling world is different. They're ranked by different groupings, if you will. So he was a level 4 racer. He's the youngest one to ever win Tour de Gila in level 4. So he was on his way to a spectacular cycling career. And I don't know if you remember the story in the newspaper about two and a half years ago now, about a young cyclist who was hit by a car down on Los Padillas.
It was your son?
That was my son, yeah. So I was at Pius at the science fair, ironically enough. When I got the text from my wife, Nathan's been hit by a car, you need to get to UNM as soon as possible. So when we arrived, this is how we found him. He had, the car was traveling about 50 miles an hour when it hit him. He was thrown about 30 feet. He had severe brain injury. The first responders thought he was dead. He and his coach were hit when they arrived at the hospital. When the coach's wife showed up, she said, "I'm here. My husband was just hit by a car on the bike." And she said, "Oh yeah, there was 2 cyclists that were brought in, and one of them is deceased." And that was talking about my son. I'm so glad they didn't tell me that, because that would have been a really hard thing to hear from the receptionist at the hospital. So the doctors and nurses didn't think he was going to make it. The ambulance drivers thought they dropped off a corpse. And I remember after the initial assessment, the surgeon came out and he said, he showed us the MRI, and there was just lesions all over his head. And he said, "We're going to have to put this thing," it's called a Volt, but it's a neuro drainage unit that monitors cranial pressure, and it drains cerebral spinal fluid to release the pressure, and it also monitors brain activity. They said, "We're going to put one of those in there, but the problem is as the brain swells, it puts pressure on the spinal column, and that's what causes a lot of the issues in these kind of accidents." They said the next 24 to 48 hours are going to be critical. So science went to work. And then I remember our Father Chique at St. Pius, he said, the doctors have spoken, and the nurses have spoken, and the ambulance drivers have spoken, but God hasn't spoken yet. And so faith went to work. And the Catholic community, the Christian community responded in such an incredible way. The prayers, I was getting cards and notes and texts and emails from people all over America, even in China, were saying, "We're praying for your son." I got a message from a former student who I believe she's fairly mystical. And she said she was at Catholic University of Washington. She said, I was in the cathedral and I was praying and I had a vision of your son in Mary's arms, and he's going to be okay. So I saw science working its wonders, but I also, he was blessed by 3 priests, a bishop. The whole world came together. So God hadn't spoken yet, and when they told us if he survives, right now he's got total left side paralysis, massive brain injury. If he survives, he will most likely be in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. Cognitively, he'll be stuck at about the 8th grade level. Just sort of prepare yourselves for that. So he did survive. That's the first time, and we ended up taking him up to Craig Hospital in Denver they specialize in brain injury and spinal cord injuries. So when he arrived, he was in a wheelchair. He couldn't barely move his left side. He was cognitive, but needed full assistance and was dealing with his entire brain injury. And again, we were told by the science people, there's help for him, but he may or may not walk out of here, be expecting some significant issues on the backside. And again, I saw science working. They were amazing doctors, amazing therapists. It's an amazing facility. But I also saw faith working in the continued prayer and the outreach and the outpouring from the Christian Catholic community. So over those 3 months, he learned to walk again. He learned how to eat again. He got his speech back. And he walked out of Craig Hospital at the end of those 3 months. And we put him on a plane, we flew him back to Albuquerque, and we took him back to the emergency room, back to neuro ICU. And the nurses were weeping. They couldn't believe that this was the Nathan that they saw earlier. Because when he was discharged up to the pediatric wing, that was the vision of him in that neck collar with his head all bandaged up and kind of out. And what I thought was amazing is that the neurosurgeons themselves couldn't believe it. They were using words like miracle. They were using words like unexplainable, phenomenal. And so I thought, what a beautiful example of how God can work wonders even within the context of scientific stuff. So he's getting better and better. This is a fascinating story. So he gets getting better and better, and he's having some issues, and we had to take him back for an MRI, and the radiologist who looked at his MRI wasn't supposed to be there that day. He was an older gentleman who just happened to be on shift that day. And MRIs are not designed to notice blood vessels. MRIs are more functional soft tissue scans. But he noticed something a little weird in the scan, and so he brought it up to the attention of physicians. And sure enough, because of the force of the injury, one of the vessels in his brain had stretched and bulged. That's called a pseudoaneurysm. And so they immediately brought him in, did another test. They said, yep, we got to do surgery. So here we are thinking, we're done. Like he's on the road to recovery. Oh no, they got to do a full open craniotomy. So they cut that whole part of his skull out of his head, and they got in there and they put a little clip on that little bulging part of the vessel, so that if it ever popped, it wouldn't bleed out, like it wouldn't stroke out. The vessel itself would maintain its integrity. So here we are thinking, what is like this poor kid? You got to be kidding me. So again, science, right? The surgeon, Dr. Taylor here at UNM, amazing neurosurgeon. He did his work, but again, chances are he's going to come out of this, regress. He might have to go back to Craig. He'll probably have trouble walking again, trouble speaking again. And then the faith community kicked in. And the prayer lines went crazy, and the support, and God had not spoken yet. And so this was done on a Wednesday. On that Friday, they discharged him. And he walked home. astonishing to all of the people in the ICU and on the PG unit. They could not believe how rapidly he recovered. And so we're at the initial thing. He's got the pseudo aneurysm, and this was about 2 years ago. And it's always been our dream to go to see Pope Francis World Youth Day, right? Anybody gone to a World Youth Day? If you haven't had the chance, you got to go. If ever in your life, go to a World Youth Day. So this was in Poland, in Krakow. And we had been working now for a year and a half with our parish. My wife and I were the leads on it, fundraising, planning, purchased plane tickets. We had 12 kids from the parish that were going to go. It was all set. And so this is the beginning of the summer, right? This is like August 1st. World Youth Day is going to be at the end of the summer. So we've got like 6 weeks. So I talked to Rutherford and I go, what are the chances that he could go to Poland in 6 weeks? Right? And this is what the surgeon knew in his mind was coming. He goes, don't plan on it. And I go, oh, okay. So I said, well, then maybe we'll just pray about it. And so the summer went by, he's going through rehab, he's doing better and better and better and better. The day before we were supposed to leave, we had our final neurology appointment. Nathan walked in. If you know about my son, he's so gregarious and outgoing and positive and uplifting. And he's like, hey, doc. And, it's a neurosurgeon. It's like, he's like, hey, doc. And he gives him a hug, and he's telling him jokes. And he just shakes his head, and I go, can we go? And he said, it's up to you, but I don't see a reason not to. It's like, gosh. Yay, God, right? So 6 weeks after they said he would not walk again, he was not going to go, there's no way you could fly on a plane for 12 hours to get over to Europe, there's no way, we found ourselves at World Youth Day, hanging out with 600,000 other pumped Catholics and Pope Francis there in Krakow. So he went on and he struggled. We had to get tutoring, and he worked really hard for the summer, and he had stuff to make up. But he graduated on time with his class. Another miracle last year as he graduated with his class. So when I talk about faith and reason on a personal level, I've lived it. I've seen amazing science take place, and I've seen amazing faith take place. And without either one of the two of them, I believe my son would be dead. And so they're not at odds with each other. They are congruent with each other. They are symbiotic in their relationship. They assist one another. So don't be afraid to be believing in Christ and in God and in miracles, and at the same time studying your chemistry and your biology and your physics and getting to know this wonderful creation that He made for us, because they live together very nicely. And here's the crazy part. You want the crazy part of the story? Guess who that is? Anybody? Take your wildest guess who that is.
Is that the person who wrote the letter?
Nope.
That's
Even more astonishing.
The person who hit him.
That's the guy that hit him.
Wow.
So that's the guy that hit him who was there on his graduation day. And so when he went to trial, my son stood up in front of the judge and said, Your Honor, I have already forgiven him, and I don't think he would do any good in jail. I think he should do community service hours, talking to young people about distracted driving, talking to the world, and I'll do it with it. So the judge is like, I have been on the bench for 12 years, and I have seen the worst of the worst, and I have never been anybody like you. So where does that fit in to Darwinian logic? Where does that fit into anything that is of this earth? Right? That's the beauty of forgiveness. And because he was not sent to jail, his life was totally turned around. He's now back in church. He is now running a prison ministry where he goes into prisons and brings the scriptures and brings Jesus into prison because he wasn't sent there. So, faith and reason is It's this beautiful combination of things in life. And those, talk about evangelization. Their distracted driving talks, Nathan would get up and tell his story, and then this guy would get up, and he's actually an insurance adjuster, and he would show pictures of cars. You know, this is a car that was a head-on collision from a texter, or this is a car, person fell asleep. And he showed the car of the accident. He said, this is a car that's pretty typical of somebody that would hit a pedestrian or a cyclist. And you can see here, there's the indentation on the fender, and the windshield was crashed in where the side of the body hit. And he said, this is the car that hit Nathan, and this is the car that I was driving when I hit it. And the crowd was like, hush. Right? And I had more questions about faith after those talks. I had people that come up to me and they're like, how can you be standing right next to the guy that almost killed your son? You know, how is your son's, what is this all about? Talk about an opening to talk about Jesus. You know, talk about an opening to talk about your faith. Like that's that value I was talking about versus validity. Like I could have talked about Thomas Aquinas and talk about Augustine and talk about the theories and the proofs of God. If you want to see a proof of God, it's those two guys with their arms around each other. So live your faith, and that'll open up opportunities to express both faith and reason in very real ways. Does that make sense? All right. Yes?
The particular topic you were talking about, where was that at St. Pius, that speech, or was it just the story you were saying? Where were they at?
Well, so those two would get together all over town. They did distracted driving talks in like schools, in McGinnis School of Driving. They went to McGinnis. There's a driving school at San Mateo and Capra. They went there. They gave their presentation to all of the driving school instructors of the state, the New Mexico State Driving Instructor Coalition or whatever, had a big thing at the UNM Continuing Ed building, and they gave their presentation to there was probably 250 driving instructors from all over the state at that presentation. And yeah, quite a remarkable story, to be sure.
Sorry, I was going to ask you one more question. What about what were the chances, you didn't say that, like for when he got up and walked out 2 days later after you said he got the surgery on his head, what were the chances?
A recovery of that,
They said he did really quickly, so.
yeah, that was, there wasn't even a value put on it. I mean, it wasn't like, oh, there's a 50-50 chance of whatever. I mean, it was just, they couldn't believe it. I mean, he came out of the surgery and he was talking, and he came out of the anesthesia that night. He's like, hey, can we call somebody up? I want some barbecue. It's like, can we send somebody to Rudy's to hook me up with some barbecue? And the doc walked in and he's just going, he's speechless. I don't even know what to say to that. Of course, the doc's like, I'm good, right? The doc's like, dang, I did a good job on this kid. And I wanted to say, yes, you did, right? Good, yay, science. But also understand that this kid has been wrapped in faith and in prayer for, the last 6-7 months. You can't deny that whole faith side of it as well. Because it was far more than anybody expected. So, but they said his chances of relapsing were fairly high, is what they told us. It was pretty much, and they may have to, you know how it is. The doc's got to tell you the worst case scenario, because if they tell you he'll be good in 2 days and he strokes out, then they're open to a lawsuit. So they tell you all the negative stuff. But I could tell in his face that he was astonished at how rapidly he recovered.
Yeah, because Father LeBlanc was, he was also talking about one of the stories similar, that there was a girl who was diagnosed with cancer who was in New York. She was like 8 years old, and her parents told the parish, and the parish went all over, and everyone was praying for her. And when they were getting ready to do the surgery, because I guess she had some cancer or something, they were noticing, or some kind of, brain tumor.
Right.
Right before the surgery, there was a woman in there, and she's like, don't worry, little girl. She's like, God has got you taken care of. And she was in a surgeon's outfit, and she walks in there, and the doctor looks, and it's gone. And they couldn't believe it. Like, it was like six weeks after the thing,
right.
And he was like, and everybody's blown away, like, well, it was just there, like, what happened? But again, like you said, the faith part of it, so.
Yeah, yeah, so true. So many instances throughout, yeah.
You touched on it earlier, Deacon, about, the reason we have faith is so important to understanding the world around us is because it answers those why questions. But one of the things that I've kind of had a hard time of, thinking about or discussing is, what's for sort of the anti-theist idea that, well, all of these behaviors of altruism that people adapted, these are just mechanisms for social cohesion that make it easier to be people together. How can you explain those sort of human behaviors to them?
Well, so I think Father's experience growing up, I think, in a communist country would shed some light on that as well. Like there is decency in the human condition, right? People being basically decent to each other does provide for social cohesion, for some sort of community support. But without sort of the faith structure, what can that morph into? Communism, socialism, the Holocaust. I mean, there's only goes when humanity becomes primarily concerned with just the human condition, and somebody decides that their condition needs to be better than yours, you get behaviors that are quite opposite of social benefit, so to speak. So for that person that just would say, that sort of argument, I always say, well then, why do you think kindness exists? Why do you think love? Just ask them. Do you love anybody? Well, yeah, I love my mother. Well, why? Where does love come from? In the universe, in the scientific world, where does love come from? Where does if your father, your mother, your sibling, your sister, your whatever, would you sacrifice your life for them? Would you push them out of the way of an oncoming truck? They may say no. I don't know, but they said, well, yes, I would do that. Well, Scripture says no greater love than this than to lay down his life for a friend. So that's why I would do it, is because of Jesus. But why would you push your sister out of the way of a truck? I'm just curious what they would say. Like, well, because it's the nicing at the table. Well, where does niceness come from? Where does niceness come from? Where does altruism come from? Where does love come from? And what is the origin of the species of that? And yet it's such a profound part of our society. And you see, if you just keep kind of drilling down to the where does it come from, right? That's one of the best ways I've had is just keep saying, just acknowledging, yep, I'm with you that one, but where did that come from? Especially on the kind of the good, positive side of life. Because most of the arguments are, this world is so awful. How can there be God when there's murders and rapes and heinous crimes and abuse of children and genocide and Holocaust? And like, if there's this God, then God is whack because. And yet, if you're arguing from the believer's perspective, like that's an interesting thing, and we've all thought it, right? Like, if you're arguing with a believer and the believer's like, how can there be God if there's so much suffering? It's a classic question all the way back from Job. It's a question through the ages. But for a non-believer, you can't not believe in God and blame God for all the crap, right? Like, you're angry. You say you don't believe in God because of all this nastiness. So you're blaming that which you don't believe in. So if you don't believe in God, then the nastiness comes from this world. Like, if you're angry at something, you need to be angry at the world because you said God doesn't exist. So don't blame him and then not believe in him. Does that make sense? Like, this world is the reason for all the crap. It's because humanity is broken and evil. It's because hurricanes happen. It's because the environment, the atmosphere, the cosmos, the radiation, the waves, the tides, the gravity, all those scientific things. That's what's happening in the world, is your science is screwy. Now, if you want to gauge a believer, that's a difficult thing. Because I tell you what, when I was going to do this, I was a believer, but I like, God, I do not doubt your results, but I sure do question your methods. You know, that was a lot of my prayers in the morning. It was like, especially being in education for all my years, I mean, there's a lot of just really, and it's horrible to say it, but I'm a Catholic geek and full of love, right? Let's love and be welcome. But there's days when I'm driving to the hospital at 2 in the morning to go be with my son who's still in a coma, and I'm thinking, man, I know kids that are like drug-using, lazy, just nasty, awful teenagers. Why isn't my son that's lying in a coma right now? And those are real feelings, and I went through it. I mean, it's just because you believe doesn't mean you don't have doubts or you don't have questions. The cool thing about being a believer is that the answer is there. We just have to believe and be patient. Anything else?
So, would you consider it kind of a worthwhile angle to approach it from, to get these, science-ism believers, I guess you could call them, to get them to consider, well, what really does science mean? What are its limitations? Because things in the natural world do have limitations, and they're arguing that there is nothing beyond the natural world. So is it a good angle to approach them from, to try and get them to consider that science doesn't answer questions the way things like philosophy and theology do?
Yeah, it's a good conversation starter. I don't know that, and I'm not going to discredit any attempt, right, to open up a door of conversation. I've never had a conversation with somebody on that intellectual level where there was any intellectual thing I could say that led them to switch, right? You're not going to switch an intellectual person with intellectual arguments. Intellectual people need to be welcomed. They need to be shown evidence. They need to see you being amazing you, and them saying, all right, what's up? All right, what's up with you, right? But certainly, because they would say, I mean, as a scientist, if I was the pure scientist argument, my answer to that would be, yes, at this time, whatever, physics has these limitations, chemistry has these limitations, biology has these limitations, purely because we have not evolved intellectually enough, or the right experiment hasn't been done to elucidate the next level, right? So in the beginning, they thought that there was, 3 fundamental subparticles, right? Protons, neutrons, and electrons. Well, now we know that there's, hundreds more, right? We've got quarks and muons, and they've got this big CERN super collider, and they've blasted these 2 helium nuclei together, and they've discovered the Higgs boson particle, and so they would just say, well, yes, we have limitations only because we are limited in our human thinking, but once we get more supercomputers, once we have a new experiment, we will discover things beyond our current limitations. So they will always fall back on the scientific process, that discovery is just the next experiment away. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I mean, and so a lot of and you can go both sides of it. You can say, well, what about the beginning? Well, okay, the Catholic priest comes up with the idea of the Big Bang, this idea of a moment in time followed by an expanding universe. And even if you read his stuff, as the priest side of him still argues in favor of the creator, right? Especially from this idea of ex nihilo, right? Something out of nothing. That these origins had to have an originator, right? And Father would call, of course, Christ or God, that's present in the Eucharist. So there's always those kind of beginning questions. Well, where did that come from? And Stephen Hawking's, remember when Stephen Hawking died, it's like, oh, Stephen Hawking's finally going to meet God, or Stephen Hawking is finally going to realize that God's real. Sucks to be him, And I was reading these posts, and I'm thinking how sad that for those that in the scientific world that are reading these comments of judgmentalism and Stephen Hawking is going to hell and like all this like vengeance and wrath, and I'm thinking, gosh, why would I want to be on that team? that's a very angry team. I want to be on a happy team. You know, we want to be on a team that says, you know, I'm praying for Stephen Hawking, and I'm praying that he did meet the Creator, and that he was, you know, somehow able to reconcile his beliefs, his talents, right? Stephen Hawking's life himself was a miracle, right? He should have been dead. How many years earlier? And that's why it blew me away about him, was how could a guy that his very existence seemed to be miraculous deny the miraculous nature of his very existence? Does that make sense? I'm thinking about, you know, how did he not do that? So yeah, when you engage, you can engage in certain logic kind of things, but also engage on the heart level, because science it's everywhere and it blends nicely, and especially if you, I think the easiest arguments are to discredit those that say science, that religion hates science. Those are the easiest arguments to refute, because all you have to do is look up the science department of any Catholic university, and there are some amazing ones. And it's full of chemists and biologists and physicists and neurobiologists and engineers who are going to Catholic universities, who go to Mass on Sundays and go to their classes all week long. And religion does hate science, right? Religion and science go together quite nicely. So those are the easiest to refute. Current topics, like stem cell stuff. That's the big one right now. Oh my gosh, the church hates people. Father, if they just could, you know, use stem cells on Father, he could walk again, right? You are suffering because of your church.
He's the proof.
Right? You're the proof of how much. But it's so wrong and it's so ignorant on so many levels. If you actually look at this whole, you know, the realm of stem cell research, the Catholic churches and universities and foundations have dumped millions of dollars and tons of hours into development of adult stem cell lines. Right? We're very opposed to embryonic stem cells because Father would no sooner take a child from the crib and kill it so that he could walk again than he would do anything else, right? And so
I actually sent a letter to the legislature that year when they were debating that, allowing embryonic stem cell research at UNM. And I wrote them, legislators, and I told them, if they come up with something, I still wouldn't take it, even though my disease is degenerative. I wouldn't take it, and I don't want it, because someone died.
right.
And I actually got a couple answers back from Catholic legislators that said they really hadn't thought it through.
Good for you.
So
Yeah. And I think that's the
one guy gave up politics after that. He said, I can't deal with this.
Oh.
But I mean, my son's a Franciscan right now, and we went on our tour. They have an entire wing of their science department is working on adult stem cells, in packaging them in bandages for use in both military and civilian use, so that when there's an injury, they wrap it in this regenerative stuff. And there's been some evidence that over time, these stem cells accelerate the healing process for wounds and soft tissue injury. And so you have this, like, one of the premier Catholic institutions in the country. It's got a whole wing doing stem cell research. It's not embryonic stem cell, obviously, but it is scientific stuff. But people make these broad brush statements, right? Oh, the church hates science because of whatever. And if you really do some research, you realize that most of the time, behind the scientific, Father Bacon was the originator of the scientific process, was a priest. Like from history all through the present time, I guarantee you, if it's legal, moral, ethical, and can help humanity, there's a Catholic scientist working on it somewhere in this country or in this world. That you can be sure of. It just takes a little bit of digging to find it. Yeah.
You go ahead.
Okay. I was going to ask, when you were saying that earlier about the science, for some reason when it comes to certain things like love, kindness, patience, science, they don't seem to have an answer for that, to the scientists. So when you say science, are people who are Scientologists, is that kind of the same thing or not?
No, the Church of Scientology is a whole other,
Box though.
yeah, that's a whole other
That's quite a rabbit hole.
entity. Yeah,
Science fiction.
yeah, that's,
I was gonna say, kind of believe in the same thing.
No.
Boxed up by Catholics and scientists.
and there's some, there's the opposite side of that. I'm not sure what, but there's like the no science religious people who, like the kids die of strep throat because
Christian
they don't.
scientists.
Yeah, Christian scientists.
Yeah.
Right? All we need to do is pray for our child, and God will heal him. Well, I don't discount that, right? Scripture is full of people who reached out to Jesus in total faith, and He healed them. I don't ever discount, for sure. I don't discount the unbelievable power of prayer. But I also think that's a little silly that your child has tonsillitis. Go get some penicillin. I mean, it's like God gave us a brain, and we have medicine, so feel free to use it.
St. Ignatius of Loyola said, work as if everything depended on you and trust as if everything depended on God. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Which means we have a part to do as much as we can possibly do.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, the Scientology is a whole other lecture.
So for the benefit of people here who might not know, could you just briefly elucidate what the kind of actual factual history of the Inquisition in Galileo was and why he was on Inquisition trial?
Yeah, so right about the time, around that same time frame as Copernicus was coming along, so theologically, you're talking about the Reformation was ongoing, right? So there was great upheaval in the church proper. You had the Reformation, you had this influx of a whole new philosophical and theological realm, the sola scriptura, the sola fide, the Bible itself was being questioned. And then you had Galileo, Copernicus, some of the other astronomers proposing this sort of, radical heliocentric sort of view at the same time. And what my reading is, and my understanding is that the leaders of the church at that time, I don't think they met with him, but there was communication with him that although they found some validity in his mathematics and his scientific principles, this was probably not the best time to introduce this like earth-shattering information into the realm of humanity. And it wasn't an all-out denial, it was a request for time, right? Because to throw in, hey, the earth's not the center of the universe, at the same time as, hey, the church is under this great upheaval, there was just like, it's more than we can handle. And so his, like, oh, the church they excommunicated Galileo because he was a scientist. Not true at all.
Not true.
Not true at all. Right? This idea of excommunication was the result of him snubbing his nose at the church and saying, I reject you and this request and your fundamental principles. And so it was actually he, excommunicated himself. It wasn't the other way around. So that's sort of the 10,000-foot view of it. And even then, the church was not opposed to his scientific principles. They were opposed to his timing and the ramifications of the culture of the time.
And he also said that's the only solution. And they were saying, you can't say that this is it,
Right.
because he couldn't prove it. Well, they had already accepted the heliocentric, but, and I think part of this stuff was wrong.
Yeah,
Some of his calculations were really off about orbit of planets and stuff. So if they had gone along with it, they would have looked like idiots, and this church still would have been, either way, I guess the church would have come out bad.
Yeah.
One of the things that I had heard before about kind of talking with atheists is, and you touched on this, is kind of that they're coming from a place of a lot of hurt and a lot of pain. And, when it comes to, living your life out in that Christ-like manner around them, and, is it is it just a matter of reaching out to them or waiting for them to reach out to you? You know, is there a particular sort of X factor to that you've seen in your life that really helps kind of bring down that barrier?
Yeah, I think that's where consistency comes in.
Hmm.
I think in the experiences that I've had where there's been some success and sort of, you know, bringing somebody along, it was just consistent Christianity. And to the point where they're actually like, why are you still hanging around? You know, I told you you're a crazy Christian. I've told you that Jesus doesn't exist, that God isn't real, and yet you keep coming around and you like, whatever, keep praying for me, you know, and you keep supporting me. But wow, when the rest of my friends abandoned me, you were still there. So that's what it is. It just, if you know somebody that's in that realm, just it'll drive them crazy. But it's like Scripture says, if you not that they're your enemy, but if you heap love on them, right, it'll be like burning coals upon them, right? So just keep loving them. Just every time you see them, be super nice. You're like, dude, I know you don't believe it, but I do. So, and I know you're going through X, Y, Z. I'm going to pray for you. I just do my prayer list. Whatever, you do you, right? The great call of the college campus right now. You do you. So let's have the Jesus people doing Jesus people stuff, right? So that's what I would recommend. Just consistently be there positively, and eventually either drive them crazy or convert them. one or the other.
Or the other. They will send you to heaven, or you will send it to heaven.
That's right. One or the other. All right. Well, thanks for having me and being such a great audience and listening to everything. I don't know what time you guys normally.
What time is it?
10 minutes to 8. I don't know what time you guys usually.
We have the room until 9.
Till 9.
Yeah.
That's what it says on the sign out there. I'll
We
take a
don't
look.
have to stay until 9.
Well, they're my ride, so I'm staying as long as these guys.
Well, thank you very much for your time this evening.